My memories with Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal are really good. I don't know if that's because I was too young to recognize the flaws in them, or if they were just my favorite because they were my first Pokemon generation. Either way, I call them my first Pokemon generation. I wasn't really that into Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow, only because they came out basically when I was born, and by the time I was actually old enough to be able to play video games and actually know what I was doing to some extent, Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal were the thing. Mainly Crystal, though. My favorite generation, by far, is Generation 3, namely Pokemon Sapphire and Emerald. I've never actually played Ruby all the way through to this day, which I find a little bit weird, but I guess since I've played both Sapphire and Emerald all the way through, kind of makes up for it. But the first generation that I actually played all the way through and have really, really good memories with is Generation 2. I've never actually played Pokemon Gold and Silver, which is why I'm really excited for their eShop release this fall. But why isn't Nintendo releasing Pokemon Crystal? Like, it has so many enhancements over Pokemon Gold and Silver. By the way, I'm just using this as a prop. It is functional, but I don't actually have Pokemon Crystal because stupid me sold it. That was a mistake. Still bitter about that. Pokemon Crystal has many advancements over Gold and Silver. It has animated intro sprites for Pokemon, and I don't remember if it has trainers or not. Mainly, it was Pokemon animated sprites where it was like, oh my gosh! It also had some of the best, I don't want to say like aesthetics or gameplay styles, I'm just going to say aesthetics. It had the best aesthetics of pretty much any Pokemon generation. Even the remakes, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, kept that intact. And quick side note, the reason why there was no Mind Crystal or whatever you want to call it is because Game Freak is not going to remake all three of those games. They're going to take the advancements of Crystal and put them into the remade versions of Gold and Silver, and so that's why we got Heart Gold and Soul Silver and no Crystal remake, which honestly I'm fine with because Heart Gold and Soul Silver are really, really, really high quality remakes of Gold and Silver. The Japanese version of Crystal did have some very kind of odd additions that the US versions didn't have. It had a communications club, it had a special distribution for Celebi over cell phones where you had to buy an adapter and connect your cell phone to your Game Boy Color and then connect to the network, and I don't remember if there was a paid service for that, but the connector was paid for and it was all just messy because it was the early 2000s and you didn't have internet distributions, and it was really, really, really difficult to actually send out modified game copies and basically just give players Celebis manually over a link cable. That would just be kind of a nightmare. I don't envy the employees that had to do that. Some of my best memories with Pokemon Crystal, and Generation 2 in general, stem from the fact that they had so much material to work with, because they were building from the hype of Generation 1 and the original games Red, Blue, and Yellow, but they also had the possibility of expanding it so much more, and so that allowed them to build a Kanto that was pretty much the same as the original games, but then build another region, Johto in this case, that just has so much more content and kind of style and spirit than the original series. Now, I'm not saying Kanto is lifeless, but it's really, really vanilla. Like, maybe that's just because I've played it so much, or maybe that's just because it's the original region and so it never got the advancements that the other regions have gotten. It doesn't speak to me. It's just very bland. It's kind of like the vanilla pudding of the Pokemon regions compared to Johto's chocolate pudding. Not chocolate pudding. That's a terrible idea. Johto is one of those regions where, looking at the map of it, it seems kind of convoluted and also really small, mainly because it focuses around a central ring of towns. Now, if you actually look at the map of Johto, it does seem a little bit confusing and kind of small compared to Kanto. Kanto had this kind of sprawling countryside aesthetic, whereas Johto is much more city-focused. Johto was unique because it had a very different aesthetic than the first games. Kanto is much more sprawling and a more countryside-style game, whereas Johto focused more on the big cities. You had Goldenrod City and Aldivine City, which were kind of your two, I would call, biggest cities. And then you had smaller towns like Mahogany Town and Cherry Grove City? Town? Cherry Grove. You just had very kind of interesting small little vignettes of towns and villages. I personally think Cherry Grove City is a perfect starting area. It has just the right amount of size to actually have the player interested without just being kind of 3 buildings and a path. But it also is small enough that the player realizes, oh, I've talked to every NPC and I've seen everything, I should probably go down to the next city. Now, I'm currently playing through Pokemon Crystal on my 3DS, and I really wish I still had my original Pokemon Crystal cartridge for my Game Boy Color, but at this point the battery would be dead and I would have lost my save. It's been well over 15 years since the game came out, and most Game Boy Color games and Game Boy games that had a battery save in them went dry after about 15 years, if not less. Some of my best memories of Pokemon Crystal are just the trainers and the characters in general. The actual dialogue, not so much, but the characters and the styling and just the whole aesthetics of the game. The graphics, the sound, the atmosphere, everything spoke to me. Now, while I love Pokemon Crystal the most, I did play Pokemon Blue. I very clearly remember being at summer camp and gathering in the main seating area and kind of sitting on the edge of the band stage and playing Pokemon Blue on my Game Boy Color. Now, I don't remember that much about it. I'm pretty sure I chose Squirtle as my starter or Bulbasaur. I don't really like Charmander. But that game never really caught me the same way that Pokemon Crystal did. Now, I have Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow on my 3DS, and I like them, but they're just not that interesting to me. Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal, on the other hand, have so much more to offer in terms of atmosphere, style, and location. Kanto is just kind of meh compared to Johto. Johto has so much more personality. The Pokemon are better, I think the characters are better, the dialogue is vastly better. I like wearing shorts. They're comfy and easy to wear. Seriously? Who is translating this? Now, my original Game Boy Color was an Atomic Purple model. I always wanted the Lime Green model, but Atomic Purple, whatever. I like it. This one is just kind of, like, everything about it just screams childhood to me. Like, this kind of is a graphical representation of my childhood. It's just perfect. And while I love Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald infinitely more than Pokemon Crystal, I still really like Pokemon Crystal a whole lot. Like, I feel like this kind of video is just me saying, I like Pokemon Crystal. I like it a lot. But part of that is everything about the game is so well crafted. Game Freak had kind of worked through all the kinks with Red, Blue, and Yellow, which were very buggy games and not really that well polished when it came to presentation. But everything about the presentation of Pokemon Crystal was just so right. The Pokemon were better. Everything about the games just kind of screamed style. And not in the same way that Persona 5 is like the most stylish game ever. But Pokemon Crystal just has this style and this aesthetic. And I'm saying Pokemon Crystal because I haven't played Gold and Silver. But it just has a style and aesthetic where it brings the player into it. The nighttime shifts, the songs, the characters, everything about it. My one lasting memory about Pokemon Crystal is the fact that I had a level 63 Meganium, which I whooped the Elite Four with. And I still, to this day, remember heart-pounding challenges against the Elite Four, where I would take my Meganium and some other Pokemon. I want to say I had a Pidgeot, and I know I had a Togetic, which is so hard to evolve. I had a Togetic and I had a Vaporeon. I remember those two. But everything about Pokemon Crystal was just a much better version of Red, Blue, and Yellow. While I'm not bashing Generation 1, Generation 2 is just so good. Generation 3, while not as technically good as Generation 2, it's just a better advancement of Generation 2. I think the Pokemon in Generation 3 are better, but some aspects of the setting are worse. For instance, it doesn't have the same locale changes as Generation 2 has. Generation 2, you go from this tiny, tiny little village in the middle of nowhere to the big city within a few hours. you get to cross the entire region and go from basically coast to coast, and then once you're done with the entire region, you start a whole nother region, in this case Kanto. Pokemon Crystal just has so much to offer, and while I'm disappointed that Nintendo didn't bring it to the eShop, I can't really say I'm not surprised. The only reason they brought Yellow to the eShop along with Red and Blue is because Yellow is basically a totally different game. I don't think of Yellow as a third version of Red and Blue. I think of Yellow as like just another version of Red and Blue. It's not a third version, and it's not kind of 1.5 between generations 1 and 2. It is a completely parallel game. It has nothing better than Red and Blue, but at the same time, it's not worse than them. It just sits alongside them. It is not a triad. Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal, however, are a triad. Pokemon Crystal has so many advancements over Gold and Silver. Gold and Silver are good games, but they lack a lot of the polish that Pokemon Crystal has. They don't have animated sprites. The story is different and a bit shorter, and it doesn't have all the extra content that Pokemon Crystal did. By the time Pokemon Crystal came out, the Game Boy Color was basically dead. The Game Boy Color was ultimately a stopgap between the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance was supposed to come out much earlier than it actually did, and therefore it would have had a longer life cycle. If you look at games like Shantae and Pokemon Crystal, you'll see a lot of similarities to later Game Boy Advance games, where they take full advantage of the hardware and are able to display far, far more capability than early generation games. And while that's true for most consoles, like looking at an early generation Xbox 360 game versus, I don't know, GTA 5 on the Xbox 360, they look like virtually two different consoles, just because the graphics engines have, of course, changed, but also the developers' understandings of them have changed. Pokemon Crystal, I think, should have been released on the Game Boy Advance. And while, of course, that would have changed a lot about it, it would have, I think, ultimately made it a better game. It would have also screwed over basically all of the Game Boy Color players, but c'est la vie. I just really, really love Pokemon Crystal. I think it is one of, if not the best Pokemon game for beginners. I think it is the first Pokemon game anybody should play. It gives you a full understanding of Generation 1 and Generation 2, and prepares you for Generation 3 in the much more varied Pokemon. Where Generation 1 kind of had its slots of Pokemon, where it's like, here's your bird Pokemon, here's your bug Pokemon, here's your little normal type Pokemon that looks kind of vaguely like a dog, or a rat, or whatever you want to call it. Here's your flying type Pokemon, here's your water type Pokemon. Pokemon Crystal, since its Generation 2, was able to advance so much beyond that. It was able to take all of those very strict categories and blend them out so much further. So you had Tauros, which was a normal type Pokemon, but it's a bull with 3 tails, and it's really kind of powerful, and it's very just weird and obscure. And I think that's a good term to sum up Pokemon Crystal with, and end this video on. Weird and obscure. It's not obscure in the traditional sense of the word, which means that nobody knows about it. It's obscure in the sense that it came at the end of the Game Boy Color's lifespan. It came so close to the Game Boy Advance, and it did so much right compared to Gold and Silver, and yet I don't see it recognized as such.